Let's get right to our panel. Joining us now from London is Guney Yildiz. He's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and has done research in northern Syria. Here with us in the studio is Giran Özcan. He's a representative of the People's Democratic Party to the United States, a Kurdish pro-minority party. From Istanbul, we're joined by Metin Gürcan. He's a security analyst and columnist for Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse. And Daniel Serwer is a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Let's start this discussion in Istanbul with Metin Gürcan. Metin, this Turkish offensive against the Kurdish YPG militia in Syria called Olive Branch has already cost Turkey 14 soldiers. Clearly, there are risks for Turkey in this. There are military risks, as we've seen. There are also political risks for the government. What is Turkey trying to achieve here?
First, I have to define this operation. This is an effect-based operation, not solely seeking for the elimination of those YPG militants, PKK-affiliated YPG militants in Afrin region, which is located in the northwest of Syria. But it's a sort of operation. The prime objective, which is to create diplomatic outcomes. Particularly, I think Ankara has been trying to disconnect the Americans' deepening cooperation with the YPG forces on the ground and PYD at the political scene in the north of Syria. And also in the west of Europe, Ankara has been trying to increase its leverage when negotiating with the end states, political end states, and outcomes with Russia and with Assad and with Iran.
Giran, for its part, Turkey says that it has killed hundreds of Kurdish fighters. Now, we have not been able to confirm that number. But what can you tell us about this region where the fighting is taking place, where the YPG is based, and what is the view of the battle from the Kurdish side?
Well, I mean, if we look at it from the outset of the Syrian conflict, the north of Syria, after Assad forces had to retreat to the south to consolidate their positions there against attacks from various Islamist groups, including ISIS afterwards, the Kurds stood against the Assad government in the north of Syria and controlled their territories and defended their territories against the very same Islamist attacks that were fighting against the Assad government. Once this happened, the north was a battleground, and the Kurds successfully defended a lot of their territories, pushed back these Islamist groups and what everyone knows, especially the Islamic State, and largely cleared the area of these groups. But among all of this, the city of Afrin that today the Turkish army is attacking has been the most stable and secure part of the country. The Kurds there have largely been defending their own territories without expanding into other regions, and at the very same time have established some sort of an administration which, by all accounts, has been a democratic, gender liberationist, a women's liberationist administration, where Kurds have been able to incorporate all other ethnicities and faiths into one kind of administration, and they themselves see this as maybe a proposal for the rest of the country.
Right, let me ask you this very quickly. To Metin's comments that Turkey is maneuvering itself into a strong negotiating position here.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much I can agree with that, with the objective goings-on the ground. Now, even if that was the objective, how that can be achieved by bombing the most stablest, most secure part of the country with, I mean, there are images coming from the ground with civilian, these are civilian inhabited areas that are being bombarded by F-16s. Now, even if Metin's point about Turkey's objectives with the operation was true, then how much this can be achieved by such huge force against a civilian inhabited area is up for debate.
Okay, let me go to Guney Yildiz. He's in London. And Guney, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he wants to, in his words, clean up the entire border with Syria. Let's listen to what the president had to say.
Bu şekilde adım adım
Step by step, we will clean our entire border with Syria from terrorists and make sure our brothers who have been living in our country for years can return to their homes.
dönebilmelerini
So, Guney, what do you know about security along this border region? And to what extent is the intention of the Turkish military to remove all Kurds from the border region?
Well, it's difficult to kind of understand how this aim can be achieved by Turkey, because one of the reasons why Turkey targeted the Afrin region is because it lies outside the security umbrella of the US. So airspace in Afrin is controlled by Russia, and Turkey was able to enter into Afrin because of their deal with Russians. But the east of Euphrates is where United States is firmly committed to protect the airspace of that region. So it's difficult in that sense. It will bring Turkey against the US if Turkish military targets those regions. But also on Afrin, I mean, in order to move to do anything else in Syria, Turkey first needs to be in some way successful in Afrin. And President Erdogan initially was saying that the offensive will be very swift. It will take a couple of days. We're in the 17th day of the operation now, and we have seen that the performance of the Turkish military is not, to say the least, not remarkable in the sense that in terms of their capturing large areas. They should be expecting to move quickly into the Afrin region, deep in Afrin region, and will face more resistance inside. But even taking over smaller areas in the border was proved to be very difficult for Turkey, and Turkey has been supported by over 10,000 Syrian rebel groups, Free Syrian Army groups, including Turkestan Islamic Front, which Chinese audience might remember them being active in Xinjiang region and in their attacks from Beijing.
Daniel, let's talk about the involvement of the United States. Of course, the United States supports the YPG, although it has said that it will stop supplying weapons to that group. But in essence, we have here Turkey and on the one side, the United States supporting the YPG on the other side, two NATO members on different sides of this battle.
That's exactly what you've got. Is a level of incoherence we've rarely seen, due in part to the situation, due in part to the fact that the Americans are trying very hard to limit their commitments in Syria, and they're trying to limit them to the northeastern part of the country, and have essentially said, Afrin is not our responsibility in any way. So by limiting their responsibilities, the Americans have created conditions for a Russian-Turkish alliance fighting people who are allied with the United States in a different part of the country.
Right. We could say limiting, we could also say capitulating, can't we?
Capitulating. The United States has always seen its presence in Syria as primarily targeted against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. That was true under Obama. There's actually a good deal of continuity under Trump as well, who also wants to limit American commitments in Syria. What they've agreed to do is to, at least for the moment, leave the Americans in the eastern portion of Syria until some sort of political settlement can be reached. But that's a faute de mieux, nothing better than that kind of solution. It's not something the Americans intended to do. It's not something they really want to do, but they're stuck. Turkey has to worry also about getting stuck in Afrin because, after all, the PYD has been governing, whether democratically or not isn't so important. It has been successfully governing. How will Turkey govern in Afrin after this war against its population? It's going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Let me go back to Metin in Istanbul. And Metin, what is the legal basis for Turkey's offensive against Kurds on the Syrian border? And what kind of international support is Turkey getting for this?
First, I have to say this, sir. I mean, this is not Turkey's unilateral move. I think what we are talking here is a negotiated outcome. I mean, after getting a green light, particularly from Russia, and after Russia's opening of Afrin's airspace, Turkey started this operation. And then the legal basis for this operation is, Turkey's long fight against PKK, which Ankara has been defining as an terrorist organization. And in the Ankara strategic calculus, YPG, particularly in the north of Syria, is directly affiliated with PKK when seeing those high profiles commanding YPG on the ground. So Ankara has been feeling itself under an existential threat. And then please do not assess this threat as the threat of the present, particularly for future, for near future, coming 2 or 3 years. Ankara has been concerned with the increasing agency of PKK-affiliated YPG, and its border security also comes to the stage. So with this preemptive move, I would suggest, Ankara, as I said before, trying to increase its negotiation power when sitting on the table with Russia and the States. And let me emphasize one more time that the success criteria for this operation is not the areas or territory Ankara is controlling, or the numbers of those YPG militants neutralized. As I said before, the success criteria for this operation is Ankara's power to influence strategic decision-making mechanisms in DC and in Moscow.
Okay, Guran, there have been demonstrations against this offensive in Europe. There have been demonstrations in Germany, in France as well. Any of that resonating, any of that being heard in Ankara?
Well, I think even before those protests, Ankara would know that this attack against Afrin, by all quarters, is taken as an attack from the Turkish state against the Kurds, although the Turkish government seeks to legitimize this with exactly what Metin was saying right now, against a so-called terrorist organization. But the whole world, the media, the international media, the Kurds themselves know or believe this to be a Turkish state initiative against the Kurds gaining any sort of status in the region. Now, as you know, half of the Kurds in the region live in Turkey. And whether it's in the Kurds in Syria, whether it's the Kurds in Iraq, whenever there is a debate about some sort of Kurdish status, whether this is independence or some sort of an autonomy, the Turkish state, probably as part of its DNA, stands against this. There are calculations about what kind of status, if gained by Kurds in Iraq and Syria, how that would have an impact on Turkey's own Kurds. Now, previously, the Turkish state has entered into processes with the PKK, directly with an organization that it's been in a bloody war for decades. Now, from a climate like we had in 2012, 2013, when which a lot of people were calling a peace process, from that kind of a climate to a climate now where Erdogan and the Turkish government is trying to mobilize and consolidate a whole nationalist rhetoric and atmosphere in the country. And in my opinion, purely down to election arithmetics, what we can say is that the Turkish-Kurdish peace process, some sort of a reconciliation between the Turks and Kurds, is being sacrificed for one person's, if not one party's, monopoly on power in Turkey.
So it's got a lot to do with domestic politics.
Definitely.
Okay. Guney, as Giran just pointed out, the Turkish people in this part of the Middle East, I mean, they straddle several borders. You know, they're in Iraq, they're in Syria, they're in Turkey as well. What can you tell us about this particular group, the YPG, and has the YPG ever posed a threat or attacked Turkey for that matter?
Well, I think the argument Turkey is trying to make is to equating the YPG to PKK, to try to count all the conflict inside Turkey, also YPG as part of that conflict. But in terms of attacks from Syrian territory into Turkey, you know, as a researcher, I haven't seen many direct you know, proof of threat, especially from the Afrin region. But what Turkey's argument is that YPG is linked to the PKK, and anything YPG gains will be you know, in support of the PKK, and it will then create an indirect threat. But on the other hand, YPG has been very careful in not posing any threat, especially most of the border is a flat border and being covered by 2-3 meter high walls by Turkey across the border. So you know, it will be a kind of suicide for YPG to try to target Turkish territory from Syrian border. So I haven't seen much proof of that.
Daniel, there clearly is concern in Europe over this offensive. The French President Emmanuel Macron has warned against a full-scale invasion of Afrin by Turkish troops. He's tempered that criticism down a bit after Turkey said that the intention is to secure the border. But why are countries like France so concerned about what is going on right now?
Well, I think this kind of incoherence affects everybody, and in France, Germany, Britain, will all be concerned about the potential refugee flow, because that refugee flow, though initially into Turkey and Lebanon, from the south into Jordan, ends up pressuring the Europeans a great deal. So I think any escalation of the war in Syria at this point is anathema to the Europeans. They want to see a negotiated solution, and this does the United States, as does everyone else if you ask them. But the fact of the matter is none has appeared feasible at this point, and I'm not seeing an end to this war anytime soon.
And Metin, if we look at the situation on the ground, we have the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, who's denounced the offensive. Now, you have Turkey taking on the YPG, which in turn has been taking on ISIL. Is Bashar al-Assad now concerned that with this Turkish offensive, his fight against ISIL is being weakened?
I mean, we have to remember another important fact. You know, in 2016, late 2016, Ankara has signed a memorandum of understanding in Astana guaranteeing the unity of Syria. So Assad and his government right now, they are they are criticizing this move. But at the end of the day, I think we will see a sort of negotiated outcome after this Afrin operation under the mediation of Moscow. Both Ankara and Assad will sit on the negotiation table behind closed doors maybe, and we will see a sort of handing over of the authority of Afrin from YPG forces to the Assad forces. This is the outcome that we will witness at the end of the day. Whether Turkey is, how can I say, the winner, or whether the YPG is the winner in Afrin. So this is the outcome. And I think Assad is waiting for his time. As I said before, in the west of Europe, Russia is the one running the show. And this is the end state Russia has been dreaming of, the handing over of Afrin region to the Assad regime at the end of today.
Kieran, Russia withdrew its forces from the region just before Turkey started this offensive. Was this coincidental or is this coordinated?
No, I mean, there's no chance of that being coincidental.
Yeah.
What was ironic was that only 24 hours before, some Turkish media actually claimed that the Russians had withdrawn from Afrin. This was originally rejected by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister in Russia, but the very next day it was said that the Russian forces had withdrawn, and some sort of agreement had been reached between Turkey and Russia for the operation to be initiated. Only a couple of days before that, Turkish intelligence chiefs and several generals were in Moscow, and it doesn't take a genius to guess that Afrin was on the table, that there was a whole discussion about what kind of operation would be conducted in Afrin. But this was almost more than 2 weeks ago, and a lot of things have changed since then. Now, we're already hearing talks of Russian jets being downed in Idlib, although it's said to be that this was from a group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which isn't under the umbrella of the Turkish-backed FSA at the moment, but Idlib is a city where the Turkish state is very active, and part of the deal to take Afrin, Idlib was part of that deal. By all accounts, this was the actual negotiation on the table in Moscow. But now, with the downing of the Russian jet, and with certain talks we're having already, now I don't think the result of the actual conflict in Afrin, no one's going to wait for that. As Guney was saying earlier, no one's expecting this to be a quick, fiery operation. This is going to take months, if not go into its first year. And I think the negotiated settlement will have to be sat down. People will have to sit down. The forces that are active on the ground will have to sit down way before that, because no one's expecting this to be a short operation. And with Russia's approval of Turkey's operation into Afrin, the discussions have already started about then the Kurds to the east of Euphrates, what are they going to do? To the west of the Euphrates, sorry, what are they going to do? Until now, there was a certain relationship with Russia. Now, if Russia is concentrated on the end game in Syria, then it's going to have a Kurdish policy. The Kurds in Syria are a sizable portion of the population. The Russians are going to have some sort of a Kurdish policy for the settlement in Syria. And until now, the Kurds don't trust a lot of the forces that are active in Syria right now, and they have depended on themselves until now.
Okay, let me go to Guney in London. Guney, what is your view on this? Do you see this lasting months and months, or do you see an offensive here with a fixed objective, with a fixed time frame? Or does Turkey run the risk, as Daniel pointed out at the beginning of the show, of becoming bogged down in this conflict?
I think there's a big risk of Turkey getting bogged down in the conflict, and I think I see this will go on for months at least, and I don't see a clear end to this offensive unless there's a diplomatic deal between or mediation between two forces. But in post-ISIS Syria, there are two main groups that will either negotiate or fight against each other to shape the future of Syria. That's the Assad regime and the YPG-led Syrian Democratic Forces. And Assad regime is Russia's main client on the ground, and they would want President Assad to come on top of in the negotiations, or to start negotiations from a position of strength. But the Syrian regime is not a powerful regime at the moment. The Syrian military is finding it very difficult to move against the demoralized ISIS in Deir ez-Zor or in Idlib. They're facing little resistance, but still not able to move as fast as they want. So they don't have enough power to confront the YPG militarily on the ground.
Right.
So what I think Russia wanted to do is to bring in Turkey into this equation, to weaken the YPG, to weaken also Turkey itself, and also Turkey pulled out 10 to 15,000 rebels from Idlib to fight against YPG in Afrin. So each force see lots of advantages as well as risks in Turkey's operation into Afrin.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.